We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. For me, the world is my playground, but it's also my responsibility. We have only one planet, and it's our task to take care of it. I'm on a mission to find out the greatest environmental issues facing humanity and what part we can play to make a difference. I'm getting down to earth, for nature, for you. Samir, bro, thanks for having me, bro. Like, Braam is literally my playground, but I've never experienced anything like this. Tell me about this building, bro.
So this building is a 6-star green building, which means that it's as sustainable as it can possibly get. Every drop of water that falls on this roof gets captured and channeled down into a tank in the basement, where it gets treated and gets pumped into the rest of the building. We also manage the environment, the temperature of the environment. All of these trees are indigenous and use very little water, and we try and make ourselves as sustainable as possible.
So, bro, something that's really polluted my mind is the fact that 50% of our water comes from 8% of the land. Balance me quickly, how does that work?
It's crazy. You know, South Africa is a huge country, and people don't realize that rain does not fall equally across the country. You know, rain is very unevenly spread, and the areas where this rain falls is really along the eastern escarpment. So those are the mountainous areas in the eastern part of the country. And those areas receive way more rain than the rest of the country. And because of that, most of our big rivers flow out of these mountains and into the rest of the country. For every 2 drops of water in our rivers and our dams, one of them originated up in those mountains. So the impact that that has on our water supply is massive. Imagine you're running a business.
Yeah.
And 8% of your products provided 50% of your income. Now, you would make sure that you protected those 8% because that is the core of your business. And what we're doing in South Africa is we're not protecting and managing the core of our water business effectively.
So what you've just said, Samir, makes me realize that there's an issue of water security. What happens when we start running out of water?
It has a huge impact on the economy and on humanity. Water is seriously fundamental to life in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. We turn on the tap here in Joburg or in Cape Town or in Durban, and water comes out and we just take that for granted. We don't realize that we are highly reliant on these mountainous areas and the water falling on in these mountainous areas. So for example, 65% of the water that comes out of our taps here in Joburg originates in the mountains, in places like Lesotho, in the Drakensberg. Durban, it's about 98% of their water comes from a water source area, and Cape Town is about 99%. So you can see that we are disproportionately reliant on water from these areas.
So how do we protect these areas, bro?
First and foremost, you need to work with government to make sure that these areas are recognized in law, because currently they aren't. And without the legislation recognizing them and giving them high priority, there's no mandate for us to protect them. But then we also need to address some of the threats that are facing these areas and work directly in the areas to not only address the threats, but to uplift the communities that are working in these areas and living in these areas to make sure that they take ownership of them and make sure that they manage them effectively.
Tell me exactly what these threats are.
Well, remember there are 22 water source areas, so the threats differ for each one. But to give you a few examples, you've got coal mining that they want to do in some of our water source areas. And when you mine coal, the rock reacts with the water to create acid. And that acid seeps into the water system and affects everyone downstream. A few other examples, we've got alien trees. So you have things like eucalyptus and pines. These are trees that come from Europe and Australia. They suck up a lot more water than trees and plants like these ones here, indigenous trees. And they essentially crowd out the indigenous vegetation and suck up way more water. Soil erosion, where soil gets washed down into the river systems, and that soil gets washed down into the dams and it fills up the dams, meaning that we have less water effectively to feed our cities and our agriculture.
So with that said, is it possible to find new sources of water, and why should we protect what we've got already?
There is the possibility of finding new sources of water. I mean, 70% of the world is water. Trying to move water is a really difficult thing. It requires a lot of energy and it requires a lot of infrastructure to do that. So what we really need to do is first and foremost make sure that we use the water resources that we have as effectively as possible and as efficiently as possible. that's where the quickest wins are, and that's the most cost-effective way of doing it. We're trying to make people aware of the fact that water does not come from a tap. You know, it has this very complicated journey that it has to travel before it gets to you. And we need to be more aware of that and be aware that water links us all. So what I do here will affect people downstream in the same way as what happens upstream of me will affect me.
Yeah.
So we need to take that responsibility very seriously.
So I read somewhere that 16% of our water source areas are protected. What about the rest of the 84?
Only 16% are under formal protection. So that means that they are a nature reserve or a national park. And the rest of it is privately owned or government owned. It's not under formal protection. But we don't want to put a fence around them and keep people out of them. These are working landscapes. There are people living there. There are communities living there. What we're saying is we need to be more aware of the fact that these areas are providing water to the entire country. And the people that live there have an obligation and a responsibility to the rest of the country to make sure that they manage the land so that the water is not affected.
So I'm obviously at the WWF, and I want to know what your role and how you plan to make sure that it's more than 16% in the future.
First of all, we work with government, and we try to encourage them to increase the level of recognition for the water source areas through policy and legislation. But then we also need to operate on the ground. So we need to realize what the threats are in the water source areas and have projects that directly address those threats. And in the process, we're trying to create what we call a regenerative economy. So we're trying to restore the landscapes to the point where they can continue to produce the maximum quality and quantity of water. And in the process, we're trying to create jobs, we're trying to stimulate the rural economy and make sure that these areas are not just reliant on mining and on agriculture for jobs, that there is this other option, which is about restoring the environment.
So Samir, here's another fact. 98% of water in South Africa is allocated. How does this affect business?
They predict that by 2030, we're going to have a 17% shortfall between supply and demand. And you can imagine, if you don't have water for industry, it means that you literally can't grow. So on the demand side, we need to make sure that we are using every single drop of water as efficiently as possible.
So what can business do to play its part?
Business needs to take responsibility for what's happening inside its own fence line. So in all of their activities, they need to be as efficient as possible. So if you are manufacturing, you need to introduce the technologies that will allow you to produce more with less water. But more than that, they need to realize that they have an influence on their employees. And if they set the standard and they encourage their employees to be more water efficient, they will extend their reach and the influence on the water system through their employees. Businesses need to realize, just like everyone, that they are connected to each other and to society by water. It means that we need to talk to each other, we need to communicate with each other.
Yeah.
So the communities need to be communicating with the businesses, need to be communicating with the municipalities and the farmers upstream to make sure that everyone is managing their water efficiently, and if someone isn't, you're holding them to account.
So do you have an example for us?
Well, you're actually in the example. You know, we try to set the example through our own activities.
We're here in the basement of the WWF building. Tell me about this system.
So when rain falls on this building, it actually generates a huge amount of water. And all that water gets funneled down from the roof and into these big green tanks over here. So this is all rainwater. But from there, we've got two separate systems. We have what we call the grey water system and the potable water system. Now, grey water is what we use to flush our toilets, because if you think about it, you don't need drinking water to flush your toilets. And that's one of the crazy things in society, is that we are flushing drinkable water down the toilet every day. Then we have a separate system which adds chlorine to the water and makes sure that it kills a lot of the bacteria and stuff. And that then goes into the taps in the toilets that we use to wash our hands. The only place where we use municipal water is in the kitchens, and that means that we are almost entirely independent of municipal water in this building.
So how practical is every single business to have a system like this?
Every single business should be thinking about this when they do renovations on their buildings or when they build new buildings. It is a very cost-effective way to do it, and it saves you money in the long run. If you think of how big a building is and how much water it can catch, that is enough water to really service the building for as long as you need if you have tanks like this that are there to capture all of that water.
I think conserving water isn't a choice anymore. I think it's one of those things that are just a part of our lives.
At this point in time, I actually don't think most South Africans have an option about whether or not we do it. We have to do it, otherwise we will cease to exist.
Only washing once a week, making sure I have a full load before I do.
I have a bucket in my shower to catch cold water while the shower's heating up, for example. I use that to either mop the floors or flush the toilets.
Flush the loo after maybe 2 or 3 number ones and not every single time you go.
It's actually quite fun if you really do get into it and you start getting other people in your house involved, because it becomes like a habit and you can turn into a little bit of a friendly competition. I think, one day at a time, one challenge at a time.
So Samir, 35% of municipal water is lost to leaks.
Yeah, it's a crazy stat. And in some areas, it's much more than that. This is water that we are spending a lot of money in taking from the dams, treating it to a level where we can actually drink it, and then we're putting it into the piping system that gets it to your homes. And along the way, whether it's a burst pipe in the street or a leaking tap in your home, we're losing more than 1/3 of that water. As a country, we're losing about 7 billion rand a year. And you can imagine what you can do with that 7 billion rand. We have a responsibility, firstly, to fix our own homes, make sure that there's no water leaking in our own homes. But also, when you see water flowing down the street, when you see it bubbling up from underneath the pavement, we need to call the municipality or go on the internet and report these leaks so that they know where they are and they can fix them. In your everyday life, there's a million different ways that you can save water and be more efficient with the way you use water. When you're soaping up or washing your hair, you turn the tap off while you're doing that, just so the water isn't flowing out and you're not using that water efficiently. When you're brushing your teeth, you make sure that you can either just take a little cup full of water and keep it there, and you can rinse your toothbrush in that when you're brushing, rather than leave the tap on and just let that water flow down the drain, essentially. So there are a lot of ways that you can be more efficient in your own life at using water.
So Samir, bro, I'd like to thank you again for having me here and giving me a bit of insight of where we stand as far as our water is concerned. But can you give me 3 more tips that I can implement to actually just teach people more about saving water?
Firstly, put a bucket in the shower, catch your water and use it to flush your toilet. Secondly, take the pipe from your washing machine and catch that water in a bucket, and you can use that to water your garden. And thirdly, when you're washing dishes or washing your clothes, make sure that you have a full load before you do your wash. There is a whole array of things that you can do, and there are resources on the WWF website that can tell you about everything that you need to do.
Bro, I'll take that in, and I think all that deserves a water break.
Been good to have you here, man.
Cool, thanks, bro.